In today's video game industry, now that time has moved on enough for the medium to be considering itself to be gaining a history, an insidious notion sometimes comes up in historical discussions known as the Curse of Threes. The curse usually comes around when discussing the ends of trilogies, which some people rightly point out was not the correct direction, or at least the most fun way that a series could have concluded. However, the curse is usually proved bollocks as well when people point out games like Killzone 3, Mario Party 3, Bowser's Inside Story, Resistance 3, so on and so forth. Some might say that the curse applies to actual trilogy concluding games, which I think is a bullshit defense of the idea, especially in the modern day, when none of the major series are given a decisive endpoint due to the self-imposed need of a money spinner. In an effort to continue settling the case, we have Resident Evil 3 as today's candidate. Resi 3 was put into an awkward position almost immediately upon conception as the early planning stages rolled on for Capcom. If you watched my previous video on Resident Evil 2, you would already know this, but I'll say it regardless. After the smash success of the original Resident Evil, Capcom decided not just to capitalize on it, but to go balls deep into the idea of a cinematic universe, planning out multitudes of new Resi projects to help conceptualize it, which led to this awkward predicament. Because of factors that Capcom couldn't control but probably should have seen coming, the project codenamed by me and no one else would not be able to hit store shelves before the PS2's launch, celebrated by Sony, so it ended up getting canned. Wikipedia describes the idea as a story involving Hunk being chased down on a cruise liner by unnamed protagonists while holding his G-Virus sample. However, Capcom still wanted to have a major release for the series available to the fans before the 5th generation Victor was smothered to death. And so, they decided to nominate one of the spin-off projects to this prestigious spot. There was one problem though. The spin-off was being directed by a team of inexperienced developers not directly overseen by Capcom at the time, the leader of which being literally described as someone who had not yet played Resi 1 or 2 and had to do so early on in the development stage. Thankfully, the plot was written by someone who did know what they were doing, and quickly Capcom Central did get involved in the project. The project was originally intended to introduce a new character until Capcom decided to slap Jill into the mix for fan recognition, and so Resi 3 was off to the drawing table. It was definitely an auspicious beginning for a game that would be bringing some actual innovations to the series even at this late stage of the trilogy. If there's one thing that Capcom did right on this venture was that it was thinking outside of the box and stretching the PSX to what people didn't think was possible. The most obvious change is labeled on the damned cover art, the Nemesis mechanics, which help to support the main concept of the game. If you didn't know already, Nemesis was a follow-up of Umbrella's Tyrant project that had improved intelligence that was developed to chase Jill through Raccoon City due to a cover-up scheme by Umbrella to eliminate the STARS unit, who have been digging up dirt on the company's role in the Mansion incident, and incidentally what happened directly afterwards. I'm not sure if it's a direct reference to the Clock Tower series, considering that the game proudly added in an ostentatious clock tower to Resi 3 early in the game, or if it's just a coincidence, but the effect produced is the same, just in a different direction. Whereas Clock Tower derived its tension from not knowing whether or not the giant shear man will find you in a wardrobe, Nemesis simply chases down Jill throughout the entire game at predetermined points, using knockdown punches, tentacle thingamajigs, and a deceptively weak rocket launcher. The game didn't need an entire redesign to crowbar in the mechanic, but was instead layered on top of the same engine from the predecessor, meaning that the usual comfort you got in Resi 2 from shutting the door on the baddies was entirely smashed down, as Nemesis becomes the only zombie in the history of this series at this point to figure out what a doorknob is. A modern marvel from Umbrella Corps. This was the point early on in the game that I thought I'd be writing down now, that the removal of any sort of hiding ability from Resi 3 was a point against the game, since early on, Nemesis encounters happen in town when you are trying to solve puzzles, and how am I supposed to solve them if a 9-foot monster is beating me down every 20 seconds? The answer was obvious in retrospect: run away for a few minutes and then come back. Once I figured that out, the dozen times in the game that you encounter Nemesis started creating that tension the game needed, since the monster's attacks are designed for the player to have a decent chance at running away from him instead of standing and fighting, due to the wild jerkiness of Nemesis's punches and how long it takes him to equip his rocket launcher. I do remember the one time I tried to be respectful towards Nemesis and actually fought him with my Magnum, and I ended up losing harshly since he literally walked through my bullets. If there is a benefit for fighting Nemesis other than at predetermined times, I have no idea what it could possibly be. Mikhail had to figure that out for me. Bottom line is that Nemesis is a perpetual antagonist and an intimidating monster with some great voice acting. Similar to everyone else that managed to scare his way into fans' hearts as an iconic bastard we were never able to kill. Another applauded addition to the game was an experimental form of QTEs, where during some cutscenes in the game, the player is given 2 choices against a threat. Pick one and you'll get a different pathway during a level. I'm not sure if any of the choices can kill you, but I can't remember one that actually did. You also get a third option if you can't pick an option for 2 minutes, and that's the point where the game might actually kill you, I'm not too sure. The different story options really help me get more immersed in the game, since Jill is essentially asking the player for input on what the next move should be. Plus, the idea was a generally good way to liven up regular cutscenes with player choices, and mostly so because the cutscenes that were this type are not signposted, and also aren't rare enough to be pointless or common enough to be annoying, a rare golden standard to hit. Additional small features were added to help justify the game's more action-oriented design choices, such as Jill's ability to dodge attacks and do 180-degree turns, making it easier to navigate close-quarters combat and have a better chance. Along with this was the addition for environmental combat, with everyone's favorite red barrels making an appearance. The placement of these barrels isn't exactly intuitive for people who've played modern games, but where they are gives the game a slight charm to it, since they're seemingly placed randomly by whoever thought that this was a good idea in the game's canon, and while it is a small detail, it helps to build the world as full of realistic human beings, especially since, once again, the game isn't being written by 17 hacks who weren't speaking to each other, and 5 of those people were making a bet on how far they could push the ridiculousness before they'd get caught. Anyway, my point is that the red barrel placement makes perfect sense for a game all about that backtracking and exploring Raccoon City, since it forces the player to figure out the best way to use them to their advantage while combating the hordes, and it expands the usefulness of their limited resources. And unfortunately, this is the time where I have to come clean about this. This review of the game is being done on an easy mode run. The reason being that Resi 3 only had 2 difficulty modes, hard and easy, and I'm not a super big fan on the whole survival part of survival horror, since it's a really easy thing that can end up fucking over what would usually be a great title and a fun time. So I never play horror hard modes. The internet does say that hard mode is basically a mislabeled normal mode, but since Capcom labeled it hard on the original product, that was being tossed out by me, meaning that easy was my quote-unquote only option left. And I will tell you that when Capcom thinks easy, they actually mean a 7 ring-fingered quadriplegic dosed in 82% lethal radiation and missing their frontal brain lobe entirely. The easy mode is so easy that it's ludicrous, with the game starting you off with 3 first aid kits and literally every weapon in the game with multiple ammo stacks. Although I was still dying in my playthrough, because Capcom didn't redesign the whole game to account for the difficulty lapse, and instead just gave us the same enemy AI and attacks, but only changing our defense stat and what resource number you find in the game and at the start. There are literally infinite save items in easy mode, which is just silly. It's not a huge deal breaker with the game, but a normal mode should be included in every game to give the audience the intended experience option. While I wasn't needing to deal with the resource management of other titles, the plotline of the game was kicking us down the path of set pieces as Raccoon City was falling to cinders and death became the staggering norm of the hour. Jill returns to the scene after surviving a building explosion and makes a dash through town to the police department to find one of her surviving STARS members that gets quickly disemboweled by the brutal hands of the subtitled villain, Nemesis. What follows is a mad dash through town and constantly figuring out shortcuts around the various roadblocks that the citizenry put up in order to futilely slow down the encroaching horde while she's being dogged by the aforementioned Nemesis and his supposed invincibility. She doesn't end up finding any survivors, but does run into someone carrying the enemy banner and a compromise. Carlos of the Umbrella Containment Service, a militia contracted by Umbrella to save survivors and contain the outbreak. At this point, the group has 3 surviving members in this unit: Carlos, Nikolai, and Mikhail. And that's pretty much all we get for sane NPCs in the game, and that's frankly a great idea. Just like with Silent Hill 2, you don't need 30 characters to have a cohesive world and an involving story, mostly because Capcom chopped down the effort, focused it, and made some truly great ones to behold. Jill is amazing in Resi 3, a sparkling improvement from the dopey but still capable every woman with no personality in the original game, and now being a helpful, courageous voice of reason in the middle of a volcanic disaster zone. However, Carlos ended up being my favorite character from this game. I might update him into my top 10 if I'm honest, because Carlos ended up being the perfect character. It might be my personal stigma against main characters being in my favor, but Carlos was simply the best. He gets a multi-dimensional, fleshed out character with a full range of traits and set pieces that set him up to be the good guy in a bad army, unknowing of the greater implications of the company he works for, and is trying to do his part while working against the longest odds imaginable. Nikolai is the twist villain of the game that isn't the best ever, since it's fairly obvious from the get-go, but during his introductory segments he seems to have a brain, he has a plan he's not telling us, yet since it works for his better interests, he starts working with the group and furthering their survival before he starts fucking them over by the end of it. And additionally, his death scene at the gas station was absolutely brilliant. That moment right there is truly the middle finger to anyone who thinks that just because a game is old, that it can't be immersive. However, even in the light of all this positivity and great ideas following up Resident Evil 2, Resi 3 has had to endure the position of being the slightly awkward middle child of the trilogy, and receiving some baffling negative attention from the spin-off turned mainstay. One comment that I read was that the game was considered too short and therefore sparse on content, which I thought would end up with the game being 4 hours long, but that wasn't the case at all. For my first run, I was able to get a completion time of 6 hours, which means that I probably spent 8 to 9 on it, which is the perfect runtime for a Resi game. Sure, it's not the dozen hours you get with Resi 2, but that game's a 2-scenario one, and Resi 3 is basically the 3rd scenario of that game, so I don't give it any stick for that. Sure, the puzzles aren't as numerous and the levels are shorter since the game has so many in the narrative, and so it had to get spread out quite a bit, yet I say that the shorter levels work better for the game since Jill is on the run for her life and constantly being chased. So being bogged down by puzzles and intricate exploration like Resi 2 wouldn't work as well with Resi 3's action orientation. Plus, some of the puzzles can actually get really complicated and actually take some thought, rather than falling back on weird key to weird hole puzzles. The first part of the game is getting to know Raccoon City and running through what Capcom thinks is a small Midwestern town, but it isn't even close to getting that right. These cobblestone streets and densely packed shops aren't even close to that intention, and it is only solidified by the game's ending, which tells us that the eventual disaster caused a 6-figure death count. The only towns in my Midwestern state that can even claim such a size are the capital cities, and that's it. Don't get me wrong, Raccoon City is still vibrant and stylish for a city blocked off entirely by automobiles and all of the lights don't work, but Capcom abandoned that whole small town thing ages ago and didn't even try ever to make that real. The locales such as the clock tower, the police department, and the factory are perfectly captured in exquisite detail, making each area of the map truly its own place, and tailored the combat and puzzles appropriately. Unfortunately, the enemy design isn't actually up to much. Capcom put in a ton of differently modeled zombies, but without the Crimson Head, it's simply a horde of copy-paste, and with the easy mode bullet overload, it becomes absolutely trivial to deal with them. Chimeras, zombie dogs, and hunters barely make appearances, which is simply sad, and the boss design is almost entirely left to Nemesis and the Gravedigger, with no one else, which is a tragic oversight for a game so detailed on every other front. Once Jill gathers the pieces to make the trolley car function again, Carlos and her use it to escape to the clock tower where the extraction chopper is supposed to be, but unfortunately Nemesis shoots it down once called, which begins a Carlos set piece where he has to explore the nearby hospital for the vaccine they were working on before the disaster, because Jill has been infected, and then it's a runabout to finding another extraction chopper. I'm not sure why they were led to the abandoned factory, but after more screwing around and avoiding a self-destruct trap, the pair finally make it to a chopper and escape Raccoon City before the actual armed forces and the President of the United States decide to literally obliterate Raccoon City. They aren't even going to map it anymore, since the fireball missile that they launched torched it into a black hole, literally. The game was more about the personal survival of Jill and Carlos against the long odds, so I'm not too down on the anticlimactic ending of it, because the climax of dealing with Nemesis was more than enough, finally being killed off by a Deus Ex Machina experiment by one of Umbrella's weird researchers. Ironic, isn't it? Resident Evil 3 Nemesis started off in a weird place, having to be scraped together by Central Capcom after their original plan fell through. But once the IP veterans of the Resi series came down to help transform this project, they did it with the ability and ingenuity that one would expect from experience. Not meaning to trash the original project leader, since I'm sure the collaboration was what produced some, if not all, the innovations this game had. But experience with the series was needed with anything going to dare call itself a main installment. Building itself off of the original Resident Evil 2 engine with unique gameplay built into it means that you get a sense of the familiar sprinkled with the new. The added emphasis on detailed backdrops and character model interaction helps to give nuance and weight to the characters and the survival mission that was going on. The limited roster of other characters you interact with are great with their own quirks and personality, and even though you have 2 interactions total with some of them, you will be able to remember their names and what happened to them, rather than a game like Battlefield 3 that doesn't give a shit. Capcom still cared enough to keep the zombie apocalypse escalation going, even though they knew the whole thing was going to be wiped out by the end of the game. Things are still falling apart, exploding, and people are dying left and right. The armed forces stood no chance, and that is a choice that I can respect above all else, because they are committed to this cinematic universe idea. Resi 3 is the unique and spirited finisher to the original Resident Evil trilogy, wiping the slate clean and open for whatever Capcom had next to add to their universe as things steadily got worse and worse until the planet itself was eventually infected. It has interesting gameplay changes, a few cool boss fights, and a badass narrative and characters. It's exactly what Resident Evil should have continued doing after Resi 2, and frankly deserves to be among the amazing games of the PSX. I don't know how people back in the day picked this game apart of all of them for this console and decided that it was a lesser experience than Resident Evil 2. But compared to what we are getting now, this game is a damned classic, and I'll be dead as a doornail if it ain't so. With that said, let's put up some final numbers and give you guys a victory for gamers. Thanks for coming in today.